Hello everybody, welcome back to yet another video with Mighty 90. Today, I want to share with you a game that was played on Lichess between two over 2,000 rated opponents. I wanted to share with you this game because although the opening and middle game weren't very entertaining, the endgame was a big fight. It was an epic game and I think you guys will really enjoy it. So, let's begin. We begin with the Petrov's defense, very sound defense from black. Knight f3, knight c6, d4. We see an exchange, bishop b4, so all the standard opening lines, both players playing top moves, up until everything's kind of okay, up until the main part I want to draw attention to, which is after these exchanges, queen h5. The first inaccuracy from white. The problem with queen to h5 is that although it targets d5, it's somewhat not necessary. It kind of just wastes the tempo. The queen doesn't belong on h5, and after the bishop goes to e6 or the pawn comes to c6, your queen is just there. So from here, the pawn goes to c4, and we see the best move from black, rook d8, and we see an exchange. I don't know why white took the pawn. I guess, yes, you want to undouble your pawns, but you help the rook out at the same time. I personally just wouldn't have played that. I would have played maybe rook e1. Just not taking the pawn and get pieces out. Well, maybe he looked at bishop a6 and queen e2. I don't know. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But I personally wouldn't have taken it. So c4, rook d8, trade, queen e2, bishop f5, an exchange, rook d8, and then queen e3, the first mistake. The problem with queen e3 is that the rook can just take on d3. And white here has to stay away from this a7 pawn. You can't take this pawn back. And I'll leave that as a little mini quiz for you guys to answer in the comments. What happens if white takes this pawn on a7? Please leave your answers in the comments below if you would like to. Anyways, that was not played. Queen e2 was played. Rook d2. Sorry. Queen f1. Really bad, not bad, but yeah, bad move. Bad move by white. It stuffs your queen in a corner. You could only see one diagonal. I don't know why they played queen f1. They should have played queen e3, and that's exactly what I would have played too. Not f3 because your pawns get doubled and it's just terrible, but e3 at least keeps you somewhat alive. Anyway, I don't know what they were thinking. Queen f1, c5, rook c1, queen d4, inaccuracy, but not losing. Rook c4 is a mistake. It says the problem with rook c4 is the rook can take on f2. I didn't even see this when I was analyzing the game, but the rook could take on f2, and if the rook takes the queen, you take with check, and after an exchange, we're up 2 pawns, just an easy win for black. So, rook c4 was a mistake. In the game, rook takes f2 was played. But after rook takes f2, the rook took on d4. Rook takes f1 check, an exchange, the pawn takes on d4, rook e7, d3. Pawn begins to march. King e1 to stop d2. If you get greedy here and take a pawn, you're toast, d2, and the pawn is going to make a queen. Computer says mate an 8. So don't do that. King e1 was played. And d2, a5, rook e2 was played. It says better is to play rook e5, and we'll see why later. It was actually played a move or two after. But a5, rook e2, or king f8, and now white chose to play rook e5. The reason this king f8 is an inaccuracy is that rook d4 or f6 was better to stop rook e5. But king f8, rook e5, a4, and we see a funny little game of cat and mouse, but eventually the rook is going to take the pawn. So black says, okay, you're going to take my pawn, rook b8, you take, rook b1, you take, check, and I'm going to start taking your pawns. Rook a8 check, king moves, h4, and here is where I want to begin the analysis, the main depth. King f6, an inaccuracy. King f3, also an inaccuracy. Says better is to play rook f4 check. Force the king to move and check him again. Force the king to move, check him again, and just keep checking him. If the king goes to h4 or h5, we just take the pawn. It's a draw. And it's a draw because maybe f6, it says it's the best move. King f4, if you take this pawn on h4, you're asking for trouble. Rook g4 check. And after king h5, king f5. If you check him, rook f4. You can't trade, or else this is lost now, because this passer will win him the game. And if you take the pawn, he takes the pawn, draw. So, sorry. Let me just quickly go back to the position. But my point is, that pawn could not be captured. So, in this position, king takes d2, rook b2, rook takes g2. Now f6 was played here. Rook a6 is a blunder, first of all. After rook b2, king f3, king g6. That rook g4 move was missed. White played king g3. Black brought his rook to b2, and said it was a mistake. From here, rook a6 check. Another blunder. This is better was to go to g4. Check the king and, again, force him down here again. But no, rook a6 check was played. f6 was a blunder. I think the opponent's idea was to have a little net around the king of safety. But it says king h5 is better. With the idea of, okay, you want to check me? I'll block with my pawn. And even though your pawn is weaker, we typically don't want to trade isolated pawns. You give me connected passed pawns, and I'm going to win this game. But I guess that was what they overlooked. Rook a6, f6, a4, king h5, rook a5, king g6, another blunder. h5 now forces the king to go back. Now the king can't invade. The king is now lured back into his own. The king is now lured back into his own house. He can no longer access the board. He's stuck, and all because of one small little pawn. So rook a7, trying to keep this pawn around. It says no g6 to trade it. Your g6 pawn is pinned. Rook a2, a5, rook a4, cutting off the white king. a6, f5, and the pawn starts to push. Rook a8, rook g4, king f3, rook h4, a7, and rook takes h5, which was a blunder. And it says rook takes h5 is a blunder, not because of what some of you might think, rook h8, which is what was played in the game, and then the queen, not because of fear of a sacrifice, but just because the rook can move. And if you try to check the king now, and the king moves, and now if you try to move your rook to a7, the queen is made, yes. The difference here, though, is that after rook to a8 and g6, the white king is close and can immediately invade your territory. So that's not going to be fun. You're going to get mated very shortly. So rook takes h5, a blunder. Rook h8, a blunder. Says no need to give up your rook, but you did anyway. King takes, and now the fun began. a8, queen, check. The king moves to h7. And now it's white playing for a draw. White has no real chance of winning here, right? I mean, black has three passed pawns, and a rook, and a fighting king versus white's queen and king. How is white ever going to win? Let's see. If he does win, maybe he'll win. Maybe not. From here, rook g5, queen f7, king h8. I don't understand king h8. It says it's the best move, but I guess it's because he doesn't really have another move, I guess. So king h8, king f4, king back to h7, says I'm okay with the draw. White says, I don't want to draw. Check, king h5, and the king starts to march. Well, it was starting to march towards his own pawns. Now he has to run back. Sorry. Queen e8 check, king f6. Another check. We kind of dance around like this. There was a blunder or inaccuracy. I'll go back to that right now. Sorry. Here, queen f8 was a blunder. And it says because you had better. After king d6, you had queen e8. Which I didn't even see this. The idea behind queen d8 is to kind of put you in a zugzwang situation. Say if you push your pawn, your rook falls. If you push your g6 pawn, which is what's the best move, we'll go over that. If you move your rook, then your f pawn falls. But if you play g6, then queen e5 check. Move the king, queen e6 check. You move the king, and now king e5. And suddenly your king is cut off. It's out of the game. You can't help your own men. So instead, king after king d6, queen e8 was missed. Queen f8 was played. King d5, another blunder. Queen e7. Inaccuracy, but it's drawn still. King d4, another inaccuracy. Queen e5, check. King moves to d3. Check. Check. King e1, what a blunder. Why? King e3. And now you're mated. I don't know how they missed that. I guess they were so focused on just running around, which is a good lesson to learn. Don't always be so focused on just moving around. You have to know where you're going. King e1, you walk right into mate. The king's a fighting piece. But both opponents missed that. Queen e3 check. King d1. Queen d3 check. King c1. White is still winning here. Queen c3 check. King d1. And now king f3. From here, g6, just trying to solidify everything. Queen d3. King's forced to c1. Queen c3. King's forced to b1. Well, not forced, but king d1 wouldn't be any good. Or any different, I should say. It's kind of the same thing. King b1. King e2 was an inaccuracy. So it's better is to go back to c6 and kind of paralyze the rook. Say you're only allowed to stay on the g file. You go on the h file, you're dead. Queen takes g6. So king e2, rook g2 check, king f1, rook g5, queen g7, and a blunder, h5. Why is that a blunder? Check. King c2 is best, queen c7 check, king b1, queen b6 check. And you ever so slightly go towards this hanging rook. Queen e1 check, king c2, queen e2 check, king b1, queen d1 check, and now no matter where you go, queen d2 check, queen g5. Let me know in the comments who got this sequence, because I sure didn't. And if you did, congratulations. So, h5 blunder, obviously missed, very hard to see. Queen h6. Here, rook g4. Queen d2, cutting this king off. So black says, all right, let's push with our pawns. Queen d3 check. King b2. Start to see some movement. But unfortunately, after check, let me go back a little bit. Rook g3 was bad. Rook g3, unfortunately, really gave white an edge because of this hanging h-pawn. Black missed the fact that this pawn on h4 can be taken. But black didn't give up. He said, I still have a rook and two pawns, and I will draw this. So rook g4, queen h6, king f3. We see some shuffling again. Shuffling again. More shuffling. More shuffling. No side really making progress until king e8, which was another blunder. Excuse me. King e8, another blunder. Why? Because king e3. After king e3, what do? Rook e4 says it's best. King d3, go back to g4, king c3, and now what? King d8, queen f7. Eventually, white's going to win this. Computer says positive 2.5. So, my point was king e8 was a blunder. Queen h8 was another blunder, letting the king out. Now the position is back to equal. Like I said, this game shifts around and around and around. One time it's equal, one day it's not. 1 second it's completely lost, the other it's not. It's epic. Queen g7, rook e4. King f3, rook f4, rook e4. Again, some shuffling, more shuffling, more shuffling. And we keep going on like this until eventually... we just keep going on and on and on and on. More shuffling, more shuffling, more shuffling. But the pawns are slowly... Now the pawns are on g5 and f5. Before it was g6 and f5. So the pawns did make a tiny bit of progress. Check, king g4. What a blunder. King g4 is a blunder because of queen h8. And now mate is coming on h3. How do you stop that? You got to move the rook. Give your king some room. And check. And queen b3. Once the rook moves, maybe to e4, just get mated. If the rook goes anywhere else, d4, then queen g3 check. King e4 only move, and the pawn collapses. And now you only have one pawn, and you will eventually lose this. Again, very deep stuff. I wouldn't have seen that either. Queen check, and queen b3. Rook d4, queen g3. Oh, sorry. That was the line I was analyzing. Let's go back. What happened in the actual game was king h5, queen e8, king g4, queen e2, check. Back to equal. Back and forth, like mentioned. King h2, rook e4. Not terrible, but drawish. Check, king g3, check. King h5, hoping for a little trick. I think queen h5 would have been a blunder. Rook h4, suddenly black is winning. But not played. Queen f3 check. King g6. Queen f2. Rook f4. Queen b6. King h5. Queen c7. King g4. Again, more shuffling. More shuffling. More shuffling. More shuffling. And it's equal. Equal. Still equal. Check. Rook e3. I think idea of rook e3 is to start pushing with the pawn. Not right now, but maybe later because of the queen d8 check. But maybe later to start pushing with g4. Here rook h3. f3. And all of a sudden, after rook g3, king h3 seems like, even though the computer says it's equal, it seems like you're slowly starting to make progress. If white's not careful, these passed pawns can win. From here, king h2, queen h8, block, check, block, king f2. That was the tragic blunder here. After queen d8, king h2. And black is lost. Because the brilliant queen h8, you force what? Rook h3. Queen e5, you force rook g3. If you try king h1, your pawn falls. Remember, you can't let the pawn die. So rook g3 is forced, and now the king finally makes himself useful, plays king f2, and in this position, after king h1, black just resigns. But I think this was an excellent game. I think it was a great back and forth battle between both sides. This game lasted almost... How much moves did this game last? Let's see. 160 moves.